we can't let ourselves be canceled. That's on us, right? We can't let moderate, reasonable voices be canceled. And this is not just because everyone has the right to speak and all of those trite
Mm,
things, but because it's really hard to complain about policy that derives from one or the other extreme when you haven't made your voice heard, when you haven't
right.
insisted that people don't have a right to shut you down. And again, I know it's hard to do that, but we really need to do it. We need to save ourselves, I guess
Yeah,
is
I
a way to
agree.
think about that. And I really do believe, and the numbers bear it out, that most Americans are moderates, either on the left or the right or in between. And being moderate in part means being pragmatic about law and policy that works for everyday people in
Mm.
their lives on the ground. Making space for having these conversations. I really appreciate that you do that.
Hey, I'm going to introduce you properly here. My name is Frank Schaeffer. This is In Conversation with Frank Schaeffer. My guest is Professor Doriane Coleman, and Doriane is a professor at Duke Law School, where she specializes in interdisciplinary scholarship focused on women, sports, children, and law. Doriane is the author of a terrific book that I have just completed reading on sex and gender, a Commonsense Approach. I want to show you the book here. See how dog-eared it is?
That's wonderful. I'm
Yes,
excited
I've
about
turned
that.
down many pages that I'm going to try to follow through when we talk here. Um, Please subscribe right now on YouTube and to In Conversation with Frank Schaeffer on Apple Podcasts and to my Substack, It Has to Be Said, at frankschaeffer.substack.com. And this book, with Doriane's permission, on sex and gender, a Commonsense Approach, we would like to make part of our book club, which is It Has to Be Read, and we would make this our January book if it's okay with you.
That's fantastic. Thank you so much.
Yeah, my pleasure. So this is such a powerful argument, and you're such an interesting person. I think I'm going to start by introducing you the way your publishers have chosen to, on the back of the book here, and just read a little bit of who you are. Uh, Doriane Lambert Coleman is a professor at Duke Law School, where she specializes in interdisciplinary scholarship focused on women, sports, children, and law. Her work has been published in numerous articles, and she is regularly cited in the press. At Duke, she is on the advisory council of Kennan Institute for Ethics, a faculty associate of the Tent Center for Bioethics, Humanities, and History of Medicine, a member of the Athletic Council, and co-director of the Center for Sports Law and Policy. She received a Juris Doctor from Georgetown Law and a Bachelor of Arts degree from Cornell University, a former collegiate and senior national champion. She ran the 800 meters for Cornell and Villanova, the Swiss and US national teams, Athletics West, the Santa Monica Track Club, the Adams Track Club, and Lausanne Sports. And we were talking a minute ago about the fact we were both born in Switzerland, and you knew where I was born, and I know Lausanne very well. But I'm fascinated by this personal experience of yours as an athlete on a big time and even international level. I think that's a first for our podcast here. We've had all sorts of interesting people that have done a lot of things, but I don't think we've had an Olympian here before.
Well, I have to correct you. I never made an Olympic team, unfortunately. I competed internationally and professionally for several years, and every Olympic year I was injured, and that was unfortunate for me. But I had the good fortune and the honor of competing for my national teams and also internationally in we call it the track circuit, basically on the
Yeah,
track circuit, and got to meet got to meet incredible people and have incredible and
yeah,
incredibly formative experiences as a result, and so I'm very, I feel really blessed by that.
yeah. Well, hey, put it this way: in the age where J.D. Vance can say that people are eating cats and dogs. We don't have to stick with facts. I'm going to say you're an Olympian, and that's it. We're just saying whatever we want here today.
I hope not. I hope not. I
That's
prefer.
not what your book is about.
I definitely prefer fact-based
Yeah, I know that from
discussion.
having read your book. You hew
Discussion.
to
Thank
the
you.
you hew to the center and the truth and the common
Yeah,
sense.
no, absolutely. Thank
Another thing on the biographical side, I was interested that your mother was a seamstress in Switzerland, and your father, and so you are a child, you are a mixed race child born in Switzerland, but then moved to the States. So there's a section in your book that I found very interesting on the sort of biographical notes here. And rather than read it to you, I've got, where did I put that it is here? The biographical personal info, page 100 and let's see, 232 to 235. And let me just get down there and see what you did there. And you talk about, I was born in Lausanne, Switzerland in 1961. The political tumult of the 1960s and the early 70s in the United States was the landscape of my childhood. I was in public kindergarten and elementary school in New York City through the end of the 1960s when Dad got his draft notice and conscientious objector status. My brother, Tokia, was born. Martin Luther King Jr. Jr. and Bobby Kennedy were assassinated. My sister Lulu arrived. And I just wanted to go there for a minute before we get into the content of your book, which I think has been shaped by your personal lived experience, as mine has, coming out of an evangelical background. My parents were American missionaries living in Switzerland, of all places, and ran a kind of an evangelical hippie commune. And I tied in a lot with your 1960s because that's my youth. You know, we had Timothy Leary came and studied at L'Abri with my father. You know, my first paying job was helping with the light show at the Montreux Music Festival, et cetera, that I, you know, you were born in 61, according to what you say, and I was born in 1952. So I'm a bit older. But before we get into the content of your book, I want to talk about that Swiss American, African American, white, multicultural connection of yours to kind of set the stage for what we're going to discuss here.
That's great. That's great. Well, I mean, so first of all, I really was born in 1961. The way you describe, you're in the sort of, are we really talking facts or not? I'm going to assume you were also really born in 1952.
I really was.
Yeah, no, I mean, so look, everyone has a childhood that is ultimately formative, right? Whatever it happens to be. That period, and I'm sure it was very different for you because you were like teenager in the 60s, and I was just coming in. I was just born and in elementary school in that period. It was really, you know, I mean, it was really dramatic. And the thing that for me, and I think it's probably different for you, and I'd love to hear what you say about your experience, but for me, it was not, I mean, it was what was there. It was normal. And it's weird in retrospect to think that normal was a set of assassinations, that normal was sort of racial and ethnic chaos. You know, in retrospect, it's stunning in retrospect. But for me, because I didn't have a period of calm like you did, I suppose, in your elementary school years, even as you were in a unique situation, right? Growing up in the mountains in Switzerland and in your circumstances, it was still just what we knew as we were growing up.
Sure.
Yeah, no, I mean, it was certainly incredibly formative for me, including on the issues that I discuss in the book on race and sex.
Yeah, and just to jump into your book, and then I'm going to read a passage here. I just want to explain to people that this book is unique because On Sex and Gender, a Commonsense Approach, is by someone who is a Democrat, self-described liberal, has fought for gay rights and women's rights, is a feminist, and then managed to get herself canceled to the degree by some, I would call, fringe elements in the trans movement, who then have kind of hijacked the image of the trans movement, but do not really represent the trans people that I know most of in any case. Before we get into the content of your book, you had a passage in your book describing what happened to a classroom lecture you were giving that was invaded by some protesters who, A, did not really understand what you were saying, and B, didn't even like the fact that you thought that gender is a thing and that sex differences are actual. And I'm going to go on a way out on a limb here, but a kind of an anti-biology reality faction that mirrors what you get in kind of political discourse when it comes to things like the Red Guards in China during the Cultural Revolution, where it isn't just a question of disagreeing. The statement is basically, we can't even talk about this anymore.
Right.
Even bring up these differences in discussion. In your case, you know, then you're accused of making trans kids commit suicide because we want to talk about gender differences as if somehow those two things are correlated. So that's not what your book is about. Your book lays out a wonderful argument for tolerance and mercy, compassion and helping people, loving people of whatever orientation, and at the same time saying, yeah, but wait a minute, wait a minute, wait a minute. Biology is real and sex differences are real. You play this through the lens of someone who has competed as a female athlete. But the first thing I want to say about the book to those who are listening and why I want to make a offering in my book club is this book is the voice of moderation I think we all long for in every area of our lives. It doesn't apply to every area, but every area we're in, whether it's discussions between religious difference or gender difference or racial difference, we wish that people like Doriane Coleman were setting the agendas for us, because then our discussions would be rational, nuanced, and civil. And I love your book for this. So before I jump into a passage here to read to you and then ask you to comment on it, just tell that story a little bit about this sort of effort to get you fired at Duke University.
So let me take just one step back. I love the way you just put the project more generally, sort of like the big sky view, because I think the approach. I actually, I mean, it is my approach, but it's not unique. I believe that most people in the United States, at least, are actually moderates, whether they're on the right or the left, and that they care about law and policy, working for regular people in their lives on the ground. Religion, high theory, they all have a place in our lives, but policy, again, law and policy has to work for everyday people on the ground, and so whether it's about sex and gender, or it's about race, or it's about anything else, right? Any of the other issues that we have, to take positions in the public discourse that are not grounded in reality and in people's reality, right?
Sure.
I think does us a disservice, and so to the extent that my approach is accessible, I think it's accessible because it speaks to that issue or that concern more generally. And so you can kind of, again, I don't propose that it's novel, but you can attach it to a bunch of different things.
Sure, of course.
And on sex and gender particularly, and then I'll get to your scene, the scene you'd like me to discuss or talk about. On sex and gender in general, I take the position that both sex as biological sex and gender as, and just a little vocabulary aside, gender as gender expectations and roles, gender as gender expression, gender as gender identity. I take sex and gender as both being real, as both being different from each other, as being pervasive as influences in our lives in ways that are good, sometimes bad, sometimes value neutral, right? And so that to me is wholly inclusive of people, whoever they are, but it is controversial in some circles, including among some trans advocates, and I don't even include all trans advocates here, but among some trans advocates and some in the trans advocacy movement, whose goal is to erase sex as biology from our law and policy and from our sense of ourselves in everyday life. And so my goal is to show how you can see both, you can value people, and in their self-identification, whatever matters to them, that it doesn't have to be either or. That my approach is just as controversial among that group on the left as it is among people on the right who don't want to see gender identity at all, right?
Yeah,
and so,
exactly.
And so,
and you make that point throughout.
Yeah.
I may just add, for those who haven't read the book yet, you balance these extremes out, and you don't sort of find the middle ground. I don't mean balance it in that sense. Your ground is always facts-based, but you recognize that these extremes, in a way, are mirror images of each other.
Yeah, and I just don't. I think it's again, it's disrespectful. It lacks humanity. It's unnecessary for either side to pretend that the other doesn't exist, right?
Sure.
I think it's right. And so I think we're smarter than that. I think we can hold two thoughts at once, right? That there is sex and there's gender, and that both matter a lot to people. So because I think that way, and I write in that from that perspective when I speak to audiences that are that either contain people who are part of this movement to take us all to sex blindness, or to erase sex from law and policy and on our everyday lives. If they are the protesting type, they try to shut me down, right? And it's
Yeah.
not only me, lots of us have had this experience who work in this area. And so the scene that you're actually talking about two different moments, but they're both the same in this respect. So I was scheduled to give a talk at UCLA Law
Yeah, that's right.
for the Federalist Society chapter at UCLA Law. And the talk, it's ironic because the talk was on how to include transgender girls in girls' sports in
Yeah.
school. And it wasn't an argument against including them. It was an argument based in the fact that it's not necessarily an easy question if you're honest about the facts, if you're honest about the science, but
Yeah.
that we should do that hard work and try to figure out how to be inclusive, right? And that it was a paper that I had written with two co-authors, one Donna Lapiano, who's one of the matriarchs of Title IX, and Michael Joyner, who is basically the world's leading expert in human performance at the Mayo Clinic, and sort of totally fact-based, science-driven, but also also utterly inclusive in its approach. But
Yeah.
it was picketed through, as I walked down the hall to go to the lecture hall,
Hmm.
protest signs and people protesting, describing me as transphobic, anti-trans hate, transphobes not welcome here. So there are all these signs. And then I go into the room, and as I started to speak, because it's UCLA's a public university, the protesters are allowed to sort of say their piece
Sure.
in the beginning, and there's a finite period of time. So they read
Yeah.
they read their manifesto, and then proceeded to clear the room essentially by threatening the other people who had decided to stay, the people who wanted to be in the audience, who wanted to hear and to talk about the subject, threatened them with exposure as transphobes if they stayed to listen to
Yeah,
a
in other words, they're transphobes just for listening to you, and you
Yes,
happen not to
absolutely.
be a transphobe,
Right,
and
right,
you're
right.
there at an event, the Federalist event, which is conservative, right wing, arguing for something that a lot of people who are part of the Federalist Society movement would not have liked
Sure,
because you're too
sure,
liberal. So
sure.
there's so many ironies
Exactly.
there, I can't even begin.
Yeah, no, exactly.
These people who were picketing
Yeah.
you were idiots.
And well, yeah,
Yeah,
and the funny thing was, I learned later that the group that originated the protest is a Marxist group, and if you go back and read Marx on gender diversity, he wasn't terribly welcoming. So I mean, the whole thing was just
it's a
irony.
little crazy.
Yeah,
Speaking
yeah,
of which, I want to come back to the Marxist angle because and this is not a rhetorical question, but I just can't figure out what the angle is here, where some of these people on the extreme of this movement identify as Marxists when Marxism was far from friendly to, this is kind of like gays for Hamas. It's kind of,
right.
have you ever been to the West Bank? I have. And, gay people get thrown from rooftops. So I don't quite get it. But anyway, let's get back to the Marxist thing. Let me read something that I think is a useful way to talk about one of the points you bring up in your book. Most of us don't have a problem with sex, and a whole lot of us embrace it. And when we talk about sex here, we're not talking about sexuality as in sex and
And
sexual
having sex.
intercourse here.
Right.
We're talking about sex as a subject, as in there are two genders, male and female, and people in transition or whatever, but that sex is a thing, the X and Y chromosome, et cetera. That's what we're talking about. The key is sex isn't only about discrimination and equality. For a lot of us, it's also even mostly about procreation, sexuality, beauty, our natural development, and experiences over our lifetimes, our morbidity and mortality patterns. We want to support people who are transgender, but, quote, freeing ourselves from sex, in other words, their X and Y chromosomes, is neither realistic nor attractive. The radical left tries to marginalize this worldview, usually by dismissing it as, quote, right wing or, quote, anti trans hate. The term now seems to be replacing transphobia in the advocacy group lexicon, but that's wrong. Knowing that sex is real and good isn't a partisan position, it's a human one. And then you go on, talk about here, I'm exhibit A in this book, but I'm in ample company. My liberal female friends from abroad who didn't grow up within the Anglo-American civil rights frame want to be free from sex discrimination. But the notion that sex itself is something we need to be liberated from is foreign to them. That's just one of the many passages in the book, I guess, toward the end of the book, in a kind of a summing up, which give the character of what you're saying. And of course, I can pick out passages where you're very critical of right-wing homophobia and transphobia and all these other things when it comes to real hate groups, and separate yourself from them. So I guess, my question to you that is not covered directly in the book is, what do you think the motivation is behind a movement that has done so much, I think, in my mind, to discredit the gay rights movement, to set it back, and to discredit the trans rights movement by moving to this Marxist extreme that winds up trying to shut down an event where you're arguing to the Federalists to accept trans people into sports and to find a way to make this happen? I mean, how did we get there? Who are these people? I'm not talking about trans people.
Right.
I'm talking about the people, for instance, who have seemed to have hijacked a big chunk of the ACLU into a movement that now hounds people like you and calls you a hate monger when you're not. And anybody who reads your book knows that you're a reasonable, educated, wonderful, and luminary voice for reason. Who are these people? I mean, what is this? And the only parallel I want to make is back to my childhood, the way that the New Left in the 60s eventually was totally discredited by the Weathermen and the violent groups that really were hate groups that acted in their name. And by the time it was all done, we had Richard Nixon. And I think there's going to continually now be a blowback. Sadly, the people who will suffer most are the people, like my producer, Ernie Gregg, and his husband, Rock, gay and married, my trans friends who don't identify with the people who have sort of hijacked bits and pieces of the ACL, for instance. I really want to ask you, because you must know who these guys are. I'm not asking for names and addresses, but what motivates the fringe of the fringe to do so much damage to the movement they purport to represent? As we see this massive pushback now from people like Elon Musk, the tech bros, all kinds of corporations that are backing out on equity and inclusion programs. Everyone has gotten sick of these folks. And what is it about it that motivates them to do this damage they've done by hijacking a movement that has at its base a call for kindness and compassion? I know that's long-winded. Now I'll shut up and let you talk.
No, I really appreciate your reflection. And I I find especially provocative the parallel to and Richard Nixon, because of course we are at a moment and right, to the election, to our own election. And there's no doubt that there has been a horrible, difficult, even violent backlash to some of the extreme positions that these groups have, or some people in some of these groups have taken. I need to be careful, not because I'm naming names, but because I'm not going to, but because any advocacy group any civil rights advocacy group that you take is not a monolith, and there is debate always within civil rights groups within any institution, right, about strategy, about goal. And trans advocacy groups are no different. There are wonderful people in these trans advocacy groups, and all the trans advocacy groups who don't deserve necessarily or shouldn't be labeled with everyone else. I just think we need to understand all these institutions as complicated. Having said that, just in general, so there are people and people in the movement who have as their goal rights for trans people. There are also people who see rights for trans people as part of a long-term strategy toward a utopian sex-blind society, right? And so trans people and gay people and women's rights and all of these sort of these struggles that are ongoing among subordinated people are part of this larger movement in their mind toward a nirvana or a utopia
Yeah.
where we're race blind, we're sex blind, we're blind to basically to restrictive categories that in their mind make us less free than we should be, or make us
Mm.
unfree, or however you might want to think about it. And so we want to be freed from our physical bodies, and from not only from what people do to us because of our physical bodies, but our physical bodies themselves, for some, are considered a cage, and
Mm.
trans people are an example of how that's, or a low-hanging fruit, if you will, for how that's, and I'm putting true in quotes here, right? For that's true for that philosophy, or for that ideology and approach, and so, if you talk to trans advocates who have as their clients and their goal this trans child or this trans person, and
Mm.
ensuring that they can go to work and rent a hotel room and buy a cake or whatever, right? And that's what they want. And they want the law to make that not a non-issue, like it's a non-issue for us
Yeah.
to go check into a hotel room or do whatever, right? That's one set of people, and then there's the other set of people that has this sort of longer term, more philosophical or ideological perspective on what the good life is,
Yeah.
and how to get there. And they're really insistent on the sex piece of it, right? They're really insistent that that's a cage, that's problematic, that binds us. It's also why, by the way, they've tied themselves into the abortion rights movement, because for them, it's abortion rights is a piece of bodily autonomy,
Mm.
and bodily autonomy is ultimately the goal, and that includes being able to curate your body as you would like to curate it, to express yourself as you'd like to express yourself in whatever ways that's meaningful to you. I would really think about it as, strategy, goal, and then goals being different, goals being more concrete versus more ideological.
Well, you have a part in your book where you talk about your own views and why, I don't want to put words in your mouth, but you would describe yourself as pro-choice, in the sense that the joy of having a family and children, you use it as an example, actually against this extreme example of not prescribing what sexuality should be. You even have a quote from somebody saying that, somehow it's transphobic to even have to identify yourself as attracted to any particular sex. So the fact that I don't long to have homosexual relations, or that my producer Ernie, who's gay, doesn't long to love vaginas more or whatever, they would define that as transphobic, because to
Correct.
even think in those categories, to even think in the category of, say, homosexuality or lesbianism as we understand it, is transphobic. So when you get out to that fringe, I'll throw something out here. It reminds me very much of André Breton in the 1920s and the surrealistic movement that basically wanted to merge the dreamscape and reality, and said, we'll find this new utopian reality by not having reality that we're bound to any longer. And, it seems to me that today, refusing to be defined by biological sex is also a kind of a surrealistic statement of a combination of reality and the dreamscape. And will founder, as all utopian promises founded. But I want to go back to the question I asked you a minute ago. What is the connection with this element of people that they identify with Marxism? What is the deal here? Why Marxism? Because it seems to me, that this reflects something my producer Ernie just sent me as a text here. The Republican Party has spent a decade unbound to reality. And I think that's exactly right. They have accepted this kind of surrealistic view of reality where they can talk about morals and family values and have this thrice divorced,
Disconnected. Yeah.
adulterated, disconnected from reality. It just seems to me that it's ironic that the left, in fighting the fire of a Republican Party that spent a decade being unbound to reality, now has an element within it which would label me or you or most gay people, lesbian, male, whatever it may be, as transphobic, because we even identify as being attracted to the same sex or a different sex or whatever it may be. What's
Yeah,
the Marxist angle here? I don't
yeah,
get this Marxist angle.
yeah. So I'm not sure, and I'm not the right person to ask about the details of this. My sense is that it's not actual Marxism. It's more that that the political spectrum no longer explains um, the approaches that different groups take to what the future holds and what it might look like.
Yeah,
I think people across the political spectrum, certain people across the political spectrum, um, are are captivated by the idea that maybe everything is a social construction.
sure.
And we are powerful enough if we marshal all of our resources to deconstruct and reconstruct in our own eyes, right? In the
Mhm.
image of the utopia that we would like to see. And so you see that from the right, you see that from the center, you see that from the left, just people who are essentially like seizing the day.
Hey,
And
it's what Project 2025 is all
yeah,
about.
well,
We're
and
going to
yeah,
deconstruct the
sure,
federal government, put
sure,
Trump supporters in,
sure. Yeah,
end all these
right.
regimes,
Yeah.
Social
And also
Security no
just,
more,
yeah.
and rebuild everything.
And also the idea that, we've reached the point scientifically in terms of our scientific capabilities to reimagine ourselves, our communities, what we care about. And part of that exercise is at its beginnings, at its origins, is
Mm,
imagining that maybe a lot of what we took as givens or as natural are actually social constructions imposed on us at some point by some other political force,
sure.
ideology. And um, and the fact in my area on sex and gender, the fact that doctors and scientists have figured out how to break us down to our bits and reconstruct us in different
Hmm.
ways is just an illustration of how an illustration of how we've gotten to be that powerful. There are transhumanists, and I'm sure you've
Yeah,
followed
sure. They're going to
this
live
movement, right?
forever. Upload
But
bits of their brain.
yeah, but
Neuralink.
but but also just sort of the idea of transcending the limits of humanity that we thought were actually limits that might not be limits, and we can now see that they are artificially imposed limits. I just think that that's not a partisan proposition either, right? I think
Right.
that you're seeing people like you were talking about the tech bros. You're seeing people, anyone in this period who sort of has a grip on either by their knowledge or by their work has a grip on sort of what the future will be, is playing with ideas that are pretty revolutionary.
Yeah.
And this includes revolutionary down to like whether we can change our sex. And
Hmm.
again, this is just like an illustration of that. Again, and full circle to your original point. Obviously Marx didn't talk about all of that, but he was a deconstructionist and a reconstructionist, right? In
Yeah.
in that very general sense.
I just a couple things. First of all, just once again, the book is on sex and gender, and it's one that I highly recommend, and we will be putting it in our book club. It also, by the way, has a wonderful signature of illustrations, including some beautiful color illustrations of art in the middle, in which you illustrate, with this beautiful signature of pictures, everything from athletes back to frescoes, from the Roman era, surprising ones, by the way, this thing that looks like people being bikinis and everything. I just couldn't believe quite that I
Yeah,
saw that, but I'd
those
seen that before. But I want to read a passage here. You say neither the religious right nor the radical left is close to representing a majority of the people. So normally their respective views, each of which contains kernels of truth, but are outliers as integrated philosophies, wouldn't be of concern. Normally, we'd be free to engage with them or not as we wished. However, because of their cultural capital, both come to have political power. And so their views come to matter a lot. And I think, of course, again, the context in which you're saying this, in which we face an election where the far right um, wants to remake America in a revolutionary Project 2025 mold and roll back everything that we would consider as more recent progress, on one hand. And then part of the impetus for that is the blowback that is made possible by people like the Rupert Murdoch media empire that likes to cherry pick the most extreme quotes they can find from, quote, the other side as they see it, and paint all liberals, all people who vote Democrat with that same brush. And they've done it with gender, they've done it with race, they've done it with feminism, they've done it with immigration. This is the oldest trick in the book. Just scan the Daily Mail any morning and you'll see what we're talking about. So one thing I just want to bring up to you and ask, kind of philosophically speaking, your opinion on is, I think that, if you look at the hubris of the post-Enlightenment rise of modern science, which keeps wanting to rebuild, the human existence, it often seems to me that both the right and the left and even the scientific community have thought that the project that's going on is a kind of a pushback against tradition, whether it's Christianity or Islam or other views. And basically, the academic community has seen itself as writing the direction that we're going in and saying, look, no more of this superstition. We're talking about science here. We can remake everything. And it just seems to me, in my humble opinion, that ironically, they've had the exact opposite effect. And that is, of course, you can look at the history of the Roman Catholic Church, as I do in my commentaries on Project 2025, and Leonard Leo and these other Roman Catholic luminaries who are part of Opus Dei and all of this. But on the other hand, what they have replaced it with is a kind of a worship of non-reason. We can rebuild everything. There is no limit to what we can do. What nobody says is, look, we've only been in our present form for about 100,000 years. Our brains are, as they are now, are maybe 30,000 years old, if that. We've been writing and thinking in terms we do for the last 10,000 years. We're newcomers to the planet. And these voices, whether it's Elon Musk or Donald Trump or the transgender fanatics on the side you talk about, when it comes to the fringe of that movement, all operate under one idea. And that somehow we, being this elite, left, right, whatever, are not part of the picture we're describing. We speak with omnipotence. We can step outside it and say there's no such thing as sexual gender differences, or we can step outside it and say, we're gonna ban the entire structure of the federal government and rebuild it. There's no such thing. We don't need these forms of order. We can come up with a new thing. What's your general view on this kind of collective arrogance of the moment, left and right, thinks we can step outside of the human experience and analyze it and start over again? Whether it's, say, there's no such things as X and Y chromosomes and we're moving past that, or we don't need social order, unleash the dogs of war, chaos will be fine, we'll rebuild everything out of it and it'll be a better America. I see this as part of the same movement, not two different things.
I mean, they're certainly not talking to each other and not coordinating, but yeah, I mean, it's part of the same conversation we were having before about how sort of futurism and utopian thinking is not a partisan proposition, right? We've given humans, or humans have given themselves, the tools to think this way and to act on a lot of their thinking, even as it's divergent in important ways. But ultimately, I think you're right that it's that these are elitist positions. I think they're largely disconnected from real, regular people who are most people on the planet. And it's not only dangerous, but it's cruel to think that chaos is fine and that we can sort of walk all over people, or that it doesn't matter how many people suffer, as ideas are pushed that again are disconnected from everyday people and the things they need to live at least decent lives, right? I mean, hope that everybody has a better than decent life, but at least decent lives. I find that it's just contrary to what I would hope our leaders would be thinking.
Yeah, one of the points you make, I mean, you argue this at length in the middle section of the book, sort of a summing up here. You say doctors aren't assigning sex at birth, they're recording it, like a meteorologist records the rain. Atypical sexual development also means that making babies can be complicated, but with support, it's often possible. And that's sort of a typical couplet you've got where you kind of state both. And then you, down the page a little bit, you say, although sex and gender are sometimes conflated, the idea they signify are importantly different. Our bodies and how they develop and are given our chromosomes and endocrine systems is one thing. That's sex. What our cultures do with our two physical forms, the social constructions that are based on our sex, and then how we conceive of and express ourselves is another. That's gender. And that's your summing up of kind of what your book is about. And one thing I want to delve into here in a little depth is the basis of your kind of compassion. And you argue, for instance, for trans kids in sports when it comes to schools and teenagers and so forth. But then your practicality, when you talk about when you get up to the professional level of international competition, there's a different standard there because this is competition to win. This is a whole different deal. This isn't being kind to young people who are finding their way. And I love that balance in your book. It's so typical of the whole book, looking for practical ways to really help real people and kind of brushing aside the ideological catchphrases and really going to the heart of where most people live. So talk a little bit about just about this difference as you argue it in your book very well, and you show very conclusively, I think, in the middle section of the book, the difference between sex and gender. And you talk about society and culture, but also science and medicine and so on. Kind of lay out for us as if it was part of a talk, a little bit of just that part of your book.
And do you want me to talk about the sports piece specifically or more general?
Whatever comes to mind, but we can get there. But I want you to talk about the science of sex and gender, how you see these two things as different. Because I think in a lot of people's minds, they're kind of so conflated now, we don't know how to pry this apart.
No, that's a fantastic question. So some of this is vocabulary / lexicon, right? So we have all we've all had the experience of having been asked our sex or our gender, and in general, they're used synonymously, and they're used in a way that is asking for our biological sex, like are you male or are you female? The word gender may be used, the word sex may be used. That synonymous use comes in English from Ruth Bader Ginsburg, and a great story about her assistant at the time she was writing briefs as she was in her lawyering days writing briefs, and her assistant apparently said, I'm typing this page and it has like sex all over it, and those 9 men on the Supreme Court, because they were all men, who would be reading this, they're not going to be thinking what you think you want them to be thinking. You want them to be thinking about sex as in our bodies and sex discrimination, not sex as in sexual relations. And so her assistant apparently, this is the story she told, apparently said, why don't you use the word gender instead and switch it out? So that they will focus where you want them to focus. And this was at a time when they were only synonymous. This was before the time when sort of the feminist rights movement, especially in academia, developed the word gender to mean initially the things that we think about people because of their sex. And so we have like I'm female, for example, you're male. What are the assumptions people make about you and your capacities and your aptitudes and what you should do with your life and how people should treat me and my aptitudes and capacities because of my sex. So the things people attach to you because of your sex. These are social constructions, right? Some of them, a lot of them derive from real sex differences, but they're in addition. So, girls and women can't do math is a gendered idea. And that difference. And then over time, of course, it comes to mean also gender expression and gender identity. The way we think of ourselves as sexed people may or may not correspond to our actual physical selves. And so those are the differences. The reality is that both are pervasive for all of us, right? We all have a sex and we all have gendered experiences, and both are incredibly influential throughout our lives, not only in physical ways, but also in also personally as we imagine ourselves as individuals internally. But also in our relationships with other people. And so, a big theme, a running theme of the book is that both are real, that both are that they're, even as they're different, they're related but different, they're also pervasive. And because they're pervasive in these ways that are sometimes good, sometimes bad, and sometimes value neutral, they're super important. And we should be holding those two thoughts at once constantly.
Well, and the problem is we've gotten to a place where the radical fringe of what calls itself a pro-trans movement, but I think actually they are undermining that movement day by day. They've come to a point where they will cancel you for even discussing these issues. You're
Oh
not
yeah.
allowed to talk about this. And I really do want to say to people who consider themselves liberal or of the left to come to a place where there are things we can't even talk about now. It would be as if, for instance, we got to a place where somehow to discuss racism means you are a racist. I mean,
Right.
this is real Animal Farm shit.
Yeah.
This is really the
Yeah.
end of the road for all
Yeah.
discourse. And of
Yeah.
course, what it does is it gives, I'm sorry, assholes like Elon Musk the excuse to suddenly go on Twitter and begin to reference not quotes that are favorable to Nazis and people who say that Winston Churchill was the villain of World War II, but Hitler was okay because basically he's flipped out to the point where now, we on the left give people enough information that sounds absolutely crazy, like canceling someone because they even want to discuss something, that now, he can present himself as a paragon of free speech when really he's just sort of a crank raised in apartheid South Africa. But there's an unseriousness to the whole discussion now that I think is tragic for all of us. And one reason I recommend your book is that not only is it a serious and beautifully written book with a lot of facts and reference, but the heart of your book is compassionate. It's where I would hope we were all going to be. The
I
idea
think,
that there's
yeah.
anybody out there who would cancel you and say we can't even talk to her because she even discusses these things is so ludicrous to me, having come out of my own journey toward the left. I can't say, how can I say any more than that? Okay, you say, going back to this idea of sports, what we call, quote, sports is really a set of related institutions. Their common feature, what makes them all, quote, sports, is that they are about organized physical activity, sometimes, but not always. A piece of this is competition. Kids, adults, and elite professionals may all play a game called, quote, basketball, but the reasons they do this are quite different. The rules of the game may even be different as a result. It makes sense to take all this into account when we're deciding who gets to play where. My sense is that people understand this, but we're fighting about it as though we don't because, and yeah, I underline this bit, sports has become a proxy for the political fight over sex itself. And again, by sex, you're talking about X and Y chromosomes, male and female, that this exists as a thing. To do the right thing here, too, we need to let the politics go. And I just love that. To do the right thing here, we need to let the politics go. And I just want to say again, in the middle of this divided country, fraught with this Trump cult on one hand and the sort of this patchwork group, we call ourselves Democrats on the other hand, but we're still an actual political party. If we don't start finding ways to do what you're talking about here, not just about this issue, but everything, let the politics go and let's just discuss this as human beings, rational human beings, science-based human beings, we're fucked. I can't put it any more clearly than that. And, then it's extremism and fanatics all the way down, and we let them control the whole debate. And I refuse to do that, which is why I talk to people from many different points of view on this podcast from the left and right. Anyway, just talk about the sports thing here for a little bit and what you talk about, because you go on, I'll start where we all start as kids on playgrounds and in gyms, on fields, in pools, and on ponds. If you're thinking elite sports from the get-go, these are development opportunities. So talk a little bit how you deal with the issue of sports and who plays and who doesn't.
I will in 1 second, but I just have to make a plug for what you just said at the end of your general overview. And that is that I know it's hard from my own experience, and I know you know this from yours. We can't let ourselves be canceled.
Right.
That's on us, right? We can't let moderate, reasonable voices be canceled. And this is not just because everyone has the right to speak and all of those trite things, but because it's really hard to complain about policy that derives from one or the other extreme when you haven't made your voice heard, when you haven't insisted that people don't have a right to shut you down. And again, I know it's hard to do that, but we really need to do it. We need to save ourselves, I guess is
I
a way
agree.
about that. And I really do believe, and the numbers bear it out, that most Americans are moderates, either on the left or the right or in between. And being moderate in part means as being pragmatic about law and policy that works for everyday people in their lives on the ground. And so allowing making space for having these conversations. I really appreciate that you do that. On sports specifically. So yeah, I mean, when we talk about sports, when people say sex and sport or separate sex sport or girls and women's sports, and that becomes this, the assumption is that it's just this one thing, when in fact, sports are these different settings. They're playgrounds. It gets more and more formalized. If you think about it as a chronology, right? It gets a chronology through the lifespan. It starts out by being just play. It turns into an opportunity for physical literacy, health and well-being. And then at one point, some of it shoots off into a more competitive, actual, sports for competition environment. In the United States, we're kind of unusual in that, and I say this in the book, sort of Team USA is born on the playground. It's born on the school playground. School sports is essentially elite development sport, but of course, school sports in elementary school and junior high school and high school, most people who play school sports, even after school formal team sports, are doing it as a social and health and welfare opportunity. School districts don't, no matter what they say and whatever state they're in, whether in a red state or a blue state, they're actually not funding their junior high school and high school teams to crown the girls state champion. They're funding them for opportunities for kids to do something healthy after school, etc. Right? And so taking the mission into account, the motivation, the institutional motivation for supporting a particular program is essential when we decide what the eligibility rules are. If you have a track team and you say, anybody's welcome. It's not a cut situation. We're not cutting down to 10 people. Anyone can play. What's the harm? There's absolutely no harm done. On the other hand, once it gets to be about competition, or it's a safety issue, right, where it's a collision sport, then obviously sex differences. I say obviously as a factual matter, sex differences are important. We have a girls category, a women's category in competitive sports, specifically to provide a space where females can compete against each other and not also against males. And when trans advocates demand inclusion of trans girls in those spaces, they're forgetting that they exist for them even to ask to be included in those spaces, to exclude them. It's not about gender identity. And so it ends up at that level, sort of, and you go fast forward to sort of elite global sport, or the way the elite athletics organizations, the federations have designed and imagined the category is for a completely different purpose than the purpose that the trans advocates, for example, are demanding this inclusion. They're demanding inclusion as part of their work to erase sex, as part of their work to reimagine all institutions, either as sex blind or as sexed, but really gendered. In the ways we've defined the two words separately. And those goals are at odds. They collide at that point, right? And so again, taking institutional mission into account, taking into account why programs exist, is what we do every day, all the time, when we're sorting people for school, for medical purposes, for all kinds of purposes. And sport is just not different.
Yeah, and I love that, the baseline in your book is always to start with, well, what's good for actual real life breathing children here. Let me switch gears for a minute. I recently interviewed Ruth Whitman, who's written this book called Boy Mom, and she's a British feminist who winds up raising her three sons. And Ruth and I had a very good discussion, and I was interviewing her. And it's not related directly to your book, but it is, because, of course, the baseline of her book is that sex matters. She's got three boys, not three girls. And she's complaining about the fact that we're telling girls, hey, you can be anything you want to be, you can excel, you can dream, you can do all this stuff. And there's a section in your book where you talk about the fact that we denigrate often male attributes as somehow, okay, they're violent, they're dangerous. We definitely have a divide here. So there's an irony of our moment. We've got this extreme group of people on one side when it comes to trans advocates who do not represent the movement. They represent this Marxist sliver of the movement, university based. Most people have nothing to do with it, but they just hear the lingo, and then it gives right-wing talking points to very bad people, from my point of view. In the real world right now, this is a tough time to be raising sons, as Ruth Whitman talks about, because in a weird way, in the real world, we've made more of these differences between male and female than ever when it comes to who's given opportunity, not necessarily on the sports field, although women's sports are doing great. And as a great fan of the women's Olympic teams we fielded in this last go round in Paris, I've just been there and done that. But talk a little bit from the point of view of your studies about the gender disparity between the way boys are being raised and girls are being raised, irrespective of this other discussion we've got, because you talk about it in your book. Where does that come from, and what do you think?
Yeah, so I really think on this issue, how girls and boys are being raised, it depends on your slice of the demographic. It's quite different among different people, even within the United States.
Right.
Certainly in my circles, sort of liberal democratic circles, and relatively privileged circles. I mean, I don't come from a privileged background at all, but I am in that world now. Um, we do raise our girls in a sex blind way, in the sense that that even if we're enthusiastic and celebratory about pregnancy, childbirth, raising kids, and all that, we also don't say girls don't do math anymore. In fact,
Right, right.
my some of my best friends and colleagues at the law school here have girls who've graduated from MIT and are superstars
Sure.
in those fields that were traditionally considered inaccessible by women because of female sex traits. So life has changed a lot in our demographic, but of course there are others in which sex and gender roles are still quite deep and
Hmm.
prevailing, and that's different. I want to focus on the boy point. I'm also a happy, very happy mother of two fabulous sons. I didn't have I didn't have girls. And they are different. They're different biologically. They're different in terms of their life experience, because
Mm.
gender roles are also placed on boys. Expectations about what they can and can't do are also placed on them, and also affect how they grow to think of themselves and their people's expectations about them and their opportunities. We're in a
Mm.
period, and I just want to make a plug for, I don't know if you've read Richard Reeves's book, Boys and Men, but want to make a plug for
Mm.
that book separately. It's got just extraordinary data on the rough situation in which boys and men find themselves today
Sure.
in educational settings, and employment settings, and relationship settings. And it's something that we need to pay as much attention to as we need to pay attention to the issues that are facing women and girls. Again, as is, it's kind of, I'm like a broken record on this, a refrain, but we can hold two thoughts at once, right? We don't have to think.
Yes.
We don't
Yes.
have to think that empowering women and girls means disempowering boys and men. I think that's a self-defeating proposition, and it's also unkind and 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 dangerous. And so yeah, I mean, I think there is, for example, there's lots of talk about toxic masculinity. I think
Sure.
there is toxic masculinity, but there's also a lot of positive masculinity.
Yeah.
And we're just smarter than that. We're better than that. We can sort through this intelligently,
Hmm.
without sort of screaming at each other and shutting us each other down, and making people, sort of disenfranchising people along the way.
Mm. Yeah. No, I think that's a good point, and that's kind of the point of your book. If you had to sum up that last paragraph that you were just speaking, I mean, it could be, on the cover, that we don't have to shout at each other and disempower each other. And I love the idea that this isn't a zero-sum game.
Exactly, exactly.
It's so ridiculous to look at things that way. It's just um, not so. And as a father of three grown children and five grandchildren, three of whom live across the street, that I've been doing childcare for since they were born, and the oldest is now 16, 14, and 10, I've kind of revisited the childcare mothering aspect of life. And just, my view is that caregiving is not just a quote female thing. And, yes, there are women, many, who can do wonderful math. And there are men out there who actually enjoy, this may be news to some people, taking care of children, including their grandchildren, and cooking for them and doing stuff. And I think real people, as opposed to the ideologues in the various camps, this is more the world we live in. Although, of course, statistically, you can look at the fact that, most child care is still done 70% perhaps by more by women than men. But what always interests me is when you go back into the history of our hunter-gatherer past, you find a lot more gender equity. You also find traditional views of sex. There's no discussion about X and Y chromosomes. The women led the gathering, the men led the hunting. But then when they got back to base camp, at least according to Elizabeth Marshall Thomas in her book, The Old Way of Living with the Sand People in the Kalahari in the 1950s, then the women and the old women got to distribute the meat. So they had the final say on who ate. And they had come up with these things, which is why they survived for 80,000 years in one place. Because they had kind of arrived at a modern science-based conclusion about how to operate. And it's only in, the post-agrarian world in which we've suddenly decided that we can know it all and change things. So I want to give you the last word. And to do that, I want to talk about how the book itself is being received. It's On Sex and Gender, Commonsense Approach by Doriane Coleman is out now, and we're going to make it our book club offering in December. But aside from that, I have two questions for you. First, when we're done this interview, if you would not ring off, as it were, when I do, but stay on and talk to my producer, Ernie, because I have a question that I'd like you to help him with, which is, could you please give us the names of some other people you think we ought to interview that we may not know about? They may have authored a book, they may not. Other people who are working that you respect that we ought to be hearing from in your field or outside of it. So please take a minute and talk with Ernie. But that said, what do you hope your book, On Sex and Gender, A Commonsense Approach, can do? And secondly, how do you see the trajectory of this? Have we peaked on the insanity of someone as common sense and kind as you being canceled before she even gets to speak because somebody, has interpreted what you're saying as somehow, that needs to be shut down? Is that going to just keep on happening? Have our lives been taken over completely by the extreme elements on all sides? And are we doomed to this? I'm 72, so is that the rest of my life? Or am I going to see a change? Are we going in a direction that's changing? Are you the only voice out there calling for common sense? Are there other people? How do you see the trajectory of your book? And how do you see what you're trying to say being received? And are we going to see some changes out there?
Lawyers would call that a compound question.
Okay, well, go for it.
Yeah, no,
You're
no,
a lawyer.
you're the expert. So in terms of what, it's there are lots of bottom lines that you could take out of the book, but given the course of our conversation, I would say that I would feel like I had accomplished an important goal if people from my work understand that sex and gender are different,
Yeah.
that they're both important, and that we have the capacity to be both pragmatic and kind about how we see people who care more about one or the other, and how we make distinctions when they're important to make based on sex or based on gender. And then in terms of whether we've peaked on the sort of deplatforming, cancellation, shutdown discussion point, this is obviously a huge topic on college campuses around the country in this period, with the emphasis on shutting those movement strategies down and returning to a place and a time when we can engage in civil discourse. Civil discourse has sort of taken on this this tone of being kind of a conservative proposition, but it's not a conservative proposition. It's an affirming proposition of the role of universities and societies, but
Sure.
also the need for engagement not only within our silos, but across silos in order just to keep the country together, right? To keep the country together and certainly to have it succeed as one. It's part
Mm.
of our DNA. It's part of the design that we're heterogeneous democracy, right?
Yeah.
But that takes work by definition. It's easy to be a homogeneous democracy. It's hard to be a heterogeneous one. And we've got to do the work and we've got to do it intentionally. I don't, I think that there's reason to be optimistic that this period that we've been through we're still partly in of not being able to speak certain ideas, use certain words,
Mm.
have
Mm.
certain discussions, talk to each other across boundaries. I have reason to be optimistic that's not our future, right? But I do understand that it has to be an intentional process. We have to be courageous. Like I said before, we have to not let people shut us down. We've got to insist on having space in the conversation, and especially space in a conversation to have discussions about what real people need in their lives on the ground, not letting the ideologues, wherever they're coming from, sort of hijack our public discourse. So yeah, it's not done. It's going to keep happening. I think it's a political MO of some groups throughout history. You referred to Animal Farm. That's an
That's right.
that's an old book, right? As these things
Old book.
go, it's not an ancient book, but it's an old book. So it's not new. This approach to power, this approach to seizing power. The way we control it is by speaking, by insisting on speaking, insisting on having a place in the conversation, and being intentional about talking to each other even if we disagree.
Hmm. Well said. The book is On Sex and Gender, Commonsense Approach, and I can just say it is a common sense approach. I love this book. We're making it part of our book club. And if we can't have this discussion, then we might as well just pull the plug on all discussions. Because if we can't talk about who we are most essentially as human beings, and if you get canceled for that, then really we've come to the end of civil discourse. And civil discourse is not a right-wing conspiracy. It's what I believe in as a liberal and a Democrat voting person who makes strong critiques on my podcasts and other areas, for what I think of as an open-minded and liberal position. Okay, so a little less boilerplate here. Please subscribe to In Conversation with Frank Schaeffer, and you'll find it on YouTube. Please subscribe, Apple Podcasts, and to my Substack commentary. It has to be said at frankschaeffer.substack.com. It Has to Be Read is my book club, and well, when I say mine, ours, and On Sex and Gender is going to be a December offering. Please stay on and talk to Ernie about other people we ought to be interviewing. And I just want to thank you so much, Doriane, for your time. This has really been great. And I love the book. I'm sorry we didn't get to talk. We had a really good discussion, but I have many, many passages marked I wanted to talk to you about, all of which I've underlined and put little exclamation points next to. I just think it's terrific. If you're vaguely interested in this issue, if you're an educator, if you're interested at all in how to relate to this sex and gender issue, this is absolutely a must read. So I can't say more than that.
Thank you,
Talk to
Frank.
you again
I
soon.
really
Thanks.
appreciate it. Thanks.
Yeah, me too. Talk to Ernie.